Okay, so negotiation. When you hear that word, you probably think, I don't know, big business deals, maybe buying a house or a car.
Right, those high-stakes moments.
But the thing is, based on the material we've been looking at, you're actually negotiating constantly, like every single day.
Yeah, absolutely. Asking for a deadline push, figuring out dinner plans, even just setting boundaries with people. It's just part of how we interact.
It really is fundamental. And that brings us to the core question we're tackling in this deep dive, really digging into the art and psychology of it all.
Hmm.
Are you negotiating as effectively as you could be?
Mm-hmm. That's the goal here. We've gone through a lot of research, expert takes, different articles
Yeah, digging deep.
to get past just the surface tips, you know?
Huh?
We want to understand the why and the how.
So the mission today is basically to pull out the most important stuff, the really practical insights and uh, tactics you can actually use.
Exactly. So you walk away feeling, hopefully, a bit more confident, more prepared for those moments, whether they feel big or small.
Okay, so where do we start? One of the first, maybe surprising points in the sources
Yeah.
is why people often, well, lose negotiations, sometimes before they even really start.
It's fascinating, yeah. The sources really point to fundamentally fear and also just misunderstanding what negotiation actually is.
Fear, like fear of conflict.
Yeah, exactly that. People often equate it with confrontation, like it has to be this battle, zero-sum thing where someone wins and someone loses.
Like you have to sort of strong-arm the other person.
Precisely. But the material we looked at argues really strongly that negotiation isn't war, well, it's structured persuasion.
Yeah.
It's about influencing things, not, defeating someone.
Okay, structured persuasion. I like that.
And the biggest mistake that comes from that fear, it's practical. People don't prepare their leverage.
Leverage meaning
Yeah.
having options, knowing you can walk away.
That's a huge piece of it, yeah. The sources really hammer this home. Think about someone getting their very first job offer. Often, you're just so thrilled, right? You get the offer, you say yes, immediately, no questions, no attempt to discuss salary.
Right, you're just happy to have the job.
Compare that to someone who maybe spends, 30 minutes looking up average salaries for that kind of role. In that city, maybe they even, mentally rehearse a quick conversation.
And then asks for a bit more. But doesn't that take ages?
Hmm.
Feel really awkward.
Well, the sources make the point that the actual negotiation part might take literally 2 minutes. Just 2 minutes of conversation.
Huh. 2 minutes.
But that difference, maybe it's $5,000, maybe $10,000 initially.
Right.
It doesn't just affect year one. It compounds. Raises are based on it, bonuses, even retirement contributions down the line.
Wow. So 2 minutes of potential awkwardness
Yeah.
for potentially hundreds of thousands
Okay.
over a career that really puts it in perspective.
It absolutely does. And it underlines that core idea that you don't just get what you deserve necessarily, you often get what you negotiate. So preparation, and especially understanding your alternatives, your leverage, it's crucial.
Okay, so mindset's huge. Getting over that fear, seeing it as persuasion. And prep, especially leverage, is like the foundation. What about the actual interaction? The sources dive into the psychology, right? These 3 mental laws.
Yes, this is where it gets really into the subtle stuff, the subconscious dynamics. The first law they really emphasize is anchor first, anchor strong.
Meaning
Yeah,
whoever throws out the first number kind of sets the stage.
pretty much, yeah. That first number becomes this mental anchor point. Everything that follows sort of revolves around it. So if you're selling something, say, and you start with a price that's, significantly higher than your absolute minimum.
You pull their perception of value up.
Exactly. They might negotiate you down, sure, but they're more likely to end up closer to your high anchor than if you'd started really low. It sort of resets their expectations.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second psychological point?
Silence. Using silence strategically. The sources point out how uncomfortable silence makes most people feel in a negotiation. We have this urge to just fill the gap.
Oh, I definitely feel that. You make your point, pause, and the silence just hangs there. It's tense.
Right. But the advice is resist filling it. There are examples where just staying quiet after the other side states their position or makes an offer. It can make them talk more.
Really?
Yeah, they might volunteer more info, maybe make a small concession, sometimes even improve their offer slightly just because the silence is uncomfortable for them, like the recruiter example. They make an offer, you pause, maybe just nod slowly. They might get nervous and suddenly add a signing bonus or something.
Huh. Your silence made them adjust. Interesting.
It's counterintuitive, but powerful. And the third law.
Right. The third one.
Know your BTNA.
BTN.
Yeah.
Best alternative to a negotiated agreement.
Exactly. Your plan B. What happens if this particular deal falls through?
Okay.
The sources argue pretty strongly that your real power doesn't come from how badly they need the deal, but how okay you are if it doesn't happen.
Right. If you have another option lined up.
Another job prospect, another potential buyer, another way to solve the problem. You negotiate from confidence, not desperation. There's a story in there about a startup founder who got much better sale terms simply because they remembered and subtly mentioned they had another credible offer waiting.
So real confidence isn't about being loud or aggressive. It's more like quietly knowing you have other options. You can walk.
That's basically it. Confidence comes from having those credible alternatives. That's your BATNA in action.
Okay, these mental laws are, subtle, but seem really effective.
Yeah.
And speaking of high stakes, the sources also look at techniques from, like, the most extreme situations, right? FBI hostage negotiators.
Yeah, this part's really interesting because it kind of flips the old tough negotiator image on its head. It introduces this idea of tactical empathy. Chris Voss, the former FBI guy, talks about this a lot.
Tactical empathy, so not necessarily agreeing with them, but understanding them.
Exactly. Understanding their viewpoint, their feelings, their situations so deeply that you can actually use that understanding strategically. It's not about being nice, it's about being effective.
Okay, so how does that tactical empathy actually work? What are the techniques?
The sources focus on three main ones. First is mirroring. Super simple, actually. You just repeat the last, say, 1 to 3 keywords the other person said.
Just repeat them back.
Yeah. So if they say, look, this deadline is just impossible, you might just say, impossible.
And that makes them explain more.
Usually, yeah. It prompts them to elaborate, to explain why it feels impossible without you having to ask a direct question or make an assumption. It keeps them talking.
Okay. What's next?
Second is labeling. This is where you actively name the emotion or the situation you perceive them to be in. Things like, it sounds like you're feeling pretty frustrated about this, or it seems like there's a lot of pressure around this decision.
So you're kind of showing you get it, even if you don't agree.
Precisely. It shows you're listening, you're trying to understand their world. That can really disarm people and build a bit of rapport, even in a tense situation. It helps diffuse things.
Makes sense. And the third technique?
Calibrated questions. These are specifically designed, open-ended questions, usually starting with how or what, instead of making demands or asking yes-no questions.
Yeah, something like...
Well, the classic example they give is, instead of saying, there's no way I can do that, you ask, how am I supposed to do that?
How am I supposed to do that? Puts the ball back in their court.
Totally. It makes them think about your constraints, your challenges. It forces them to start thinking about solutions that might actually work for you, but you haven't actually said no or made a demand yourself.
That's clever. You're guiding them without being pushy.
It's about controlling the flow through inquiry, not assertion. Really powerful stuff.
It's amazing, really, how techniques from, life or death scenarios can apply to everyday stuff. And the sources don't just stop there, right? They go back in history, too.
Yeah, they look at historical figures to show these aren't just like modern psychological tricks. They mention Napoleon Bonaparte, for instance.
Napoleon, as a negotiator.
Apparently, he was a master of the psychological game.
Yeah.
The sources talk about how he'd deliberately make ambassadors or opponents wait for hours, sometimes even days, just to meet with him.
Seriously. Just leaving them hanging.
Yeah, think about it. They arrive anxious, maybe tired, probably increasingly desperate just to get the meeting done.
No.
He was negotiating before a word was even spoken, building psychological leverage.
Wow. Manipulating the situation itself.
And he'd also structure treaties, peace deals, where maybe he wasn't giving up much, but he'd frame it through propaganda as this incredibly generous act. Managing the perception, the narrative, was key.
Perception is huge. Okay? And more recently, Steve Jobs.
Right. The sources bring up the Pixar acquisition by Disney. Jobs was obviously in a pretty strong position with Pixar's success.
He wanted the deal, though, right?
Right. He did. But according to the analysis, he didn't act like he needed it. He wasn't overly eager. He projected the sort of coolness, maybe even slight indifference.
Kind of played hard to get.
More like projecting strength. He subtly got across the idea that Pixar was doing great on its own, and maybe it was Disney who needed Pixar more, which, ties right back to that BATNA principle.
Making them feel you're the one with the options, even if you want their deal.
Exactly. Projecting that you're okay walking away.
Yeah.
And the outcome.
What happened with that deal?
Well, it ended up being a massive $7.4 billion acquisition. Jobs got a huge payout, yes. But he also became Disney's largest individual shareholder and ended up on their board, heavily influencing their animation future.
Incredible.
So the lesson from these historical snapshots seems to be that projecting strength, projecting that you don't desperately need this specific outcome, is a really powerful psychological tool.
Okay, so bringing all this together, the mindset, the psychology, the FBI tactics, the history, the sources kind of boil it down, right? Into like 5 key rules we can actually use.
Yeah, they synthesize it into actionable advice. Rule 1 is basically prepare more than you think you need to. Maybe even more than the other side expects.
Know your stuff.
Know your facts, know the market rates if it's relevant, know your own BATNA inside and out. Research is power, don't just wing it.
Right, don't walk in cold. Okay, what's 2?
Never reveal your bottom line first.
Mm.
We talked about anchoring often, letting them make the first offer works better for you. If you have to anchor, aim high if you're selling, low if you're buying, but never, ever start at your actual walkaway number.
Keep that absolute limit to yourself.
Got it.
3rd, be willing to walk away. And, importantly, be perceived as willing to walk away. This goes back to your BTNA. If they genuinely believe you might walk, you have immense leverage. If they sense you have to make this deal,
they've got you. Even if your BTNA isn't perfect, just the belief you might use, it counts.
it makes a huge difference. Okay, 4th rule, turn emotions into leverage.
How does that work? It means understanding their emotions, using things like labeling, and sometimes maybe strategically using your own. Not being fake, but perhaps showing calculated disappointment or surprise to steer things. It's about acknowledging and navigating the emotional side, not ignoring it.
So working with the emotions in the room, not against them.
Exactly. And the 5th and final rule they emphasize. Remember to negotiate relationships too, not just the deal points.
Ah, the long game.
Especially in ongoing situations, colleagues, clients, even family. Preserving trust, maintaining a good long-term dynamic is often just as vital as winning on one specific point today. Good negotiation isn't always just a one-off transaction.
You know, this whole deep dive has really shifted how I think about negotiation. It feels less like preparing for battle and much more about, I don't know, skillful interaction.
Yeah, the sources definitely paint a picture where the best negotiators aren't necessarily the loudest or the most aggressive ones.
No, they're the ones who seem calm, patient,
Super well prepared.
and really understand the human psychology side of things. Strategic.
They're not trying to push people around. It's more like they use these subtle techniques to gently pull the other person towards the outcome they want. It all comes back to that preparation, understanding the mental game, and crucially, having options.
Preparation, psychology, and leverage. That seems to be the core. So, maybe for you listening, think about the next time you might need to negotiate something. Could be small, could be big. How could you approach it differently now?
Yeah, how can you figure out your leverage beforehand? Could you use a bit of strategic silence, maybe? Or try a calibrated question? How can you make an effort to genuinely see it from their side, even for a moment?
And maybe a final thought to leave you with, something the sources hinted at. Perhaps the real mastery in negotiation is guiding the other side so effectively that when you reach that agreement you were aiming for, they actually feel like it was their great idea all along.